Larry Linville had the world at his feet: fame, money, and a hit role that millions loved to hate. Yet at the height of his success, he stunned Hollywood by walking away. Some blamed the scripts. Others whispered about behind-the-scenes tension, hidden health issues, or a fear of being trapped forever as Frank Burns. But the real reason he left MASH * was more complicated and more heartbreaking than anyone expected. When the show premiered in 1972, audiences immediately connected with its mix of dark comedy and emotional storytelling. Few expected that one of its most despised characters would also become one of its most beloved. Larry Linville's portrayal of Major Frank Burns was masterful. He wasn't the hero or the wisecracking friend. He was the insecure, petty, self-righteous foil that everyone enjoyed laughing at. His nasal voice, twitchy mannerisms, constant rule-obsessed whining made him the perfect target for Hawkeye's pranks. And viewers couldn't get enough. What most people didn't realize was how much skill went into the role. Linville had to strike a razor-thin balance. If he played Frank too villainously, people would genuinely hate him. Too softly, and the comedy would collapse. Instead, he created a character who was both ridiculous and irresistible. Even while rooting against Frank, audiences loved watching him. His cowardice became comedy, his jealousy became entertainment, and every meltdown turned into a scene-stealing moment as the seasons passed. Linville became one of the show's most valuable assets. Ratings soared and viewers tuned in just to see Frank's next disaster. He was the character audiences loved to hate, and without him, the chaotic balance among Hawkeye, Trapper, Margaret, and Colonel Blake wouldn't have worked. In many ways, held the comedy together, even though his character was constantly being torn apart. But behind all the laughter, cracks began to form. While the world enjoyed watching Frank Burns fail again and again, Linville feared he was failing too. The storylines became repetitive. Chase Margaret, get humiliated by Hawkeye, sulk in the corner. The role that made him famous was now boxing him in, turning him into the very thing he feared: an actor defined entirely by a character is meant to be hated. As a trained stage actor with roots in Shakespeare and drama, Linville wanted complexity. But MASH * was simplifying Frank, stripping him down to a predictable caricature. Meanwhile, other characters were evolving. Margaret became multifaceted and sympathetic. Hawkeye gained emotional depth. Radar had surprising growth. Frank alone stayed frozen as the fool. When Linville's 5-year contract ended in the mid-1970s during the show's peak, he faced a life-changing decision. CBS wanted him back. Fans adored him. The money was excellent, but Linville was miserable. Signing on meant more stability, but also years of playing a stagnant, shallow version of a character who no longer challenged him. He agonized over the choice. Friends said he feared being laughed at not just as Frank, but as Larry himself. The line between actor and character was blurring. He worried he'd be typecast for life. In the end, he made a bold and risky decision. He walked away from fame, from a guaranteed fortune, and from one of the biggest shows in television history. His departure surprised producers, saddened his castmates, and left fans stunned. Officially, it was framed as a creative choice. Unofficially, rumors circulated about tension, power struggles, and frustrations far deeper than the scripts. Whatever the mix of reasons, his exit reshaped the future of the show and marked the beginning of a much more challenging chapter in his career and life. But in Hollywood, simple explanations rarely tell the whole story. Whispered rumors soon began circulating about what was really happening behind the scenes, and those whispers hinted at quiet rivalries, creative disagreements, and frustrations that may have pushed Linville out sooner than anyone expected. At the center of these rumors was Alan Alda. By the mid-1970s, Alda wasn't just the lead actor, he was becoming the show's creative core. He wrote episodes, directed pivotal storylines, and helped shift the tone of MASH * from a sharp, chaotic comedy to a blend of humor and serious commentary on the emotional weight of war. Viewers embraced the change, critics praised it, and CBS gave Alda tremendous creative freedom. But the evolution that elevated the series also made certain characters, especially Frank Burns, feel like leftovers from an earlier version of the show. Linville seemed to notice the shift immediately. Early in the series, Frank wasn't merely a buffoon, he was a genuine antagonist. Strict, petty, sometimes even threatening. He created tension that fueled the dynamic between Hawkeye, Trapper, and the rest of the unit. But as the show leaned deeper into emotional storytelling, Frank was gradually reduced to little more than comic relief. Margaret Houlihan grew more complex and sympathetic. Radar developed surprising depth. Even side characters got moments of humanity. Frank, meanwhile, stayed trapped in the same loop, throwing tantrums, pining after Margaret, tattling on everyone, and being humiliated by Hawkeye. Screen time issues soon followed. When Wayne Rogers' Trapper John left the show, spotlight shifted more heavily toward Hawkeye and B.J. Hunnicutt. Linville's role shrank. When Frank did appear, it was often as the punchline. Some people claimed he grew frustrated with being pushed to play Frank, as more foolish than he believed necessary. As a trained stage actor with a background in serious theater, he wanted nuance, even in comedy. Watching his character become increasingly one-dimensional may have felt like watching his credibility slip away. Not everyone agreed with that interpretation. Some insiders described Linville as professional and easygoing, but acknowledged that he struggled with how audiences treated him. Fans sometimes blurred the line between actor and character, jeering at him in public as if he were the conniving, cowardly Frank Burns in real life. Even the strongest actor might crumble under that kind of attention, and Linville wasn't immune. Friends said he grew tired of being recognized only as Frank, as though he had no identity beyond the 4077th. There were also darker theories floating around. The idea that Linville felt overshadowed by Alda's expanding influence, or that he resented how little control he had over Frank's fate. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated, they fed the perception that Linville's frustration wasn't just with the writing, but with the entire creative direction of the show. Was it ego? Artistic pride? Exhaustion from years of playing a character defined by humiliation? The truth was likely a blend of all three. Whatever the real reasons, Linville's exit wasn't just a career choice, it felt like an act of defiance against a system that was flattening him into a caricature, but leaving. Asterix didn't give him the freedom he imagined, because once he stepped away, Linville discovered something harsh. Hollywood didn't want Larry Linville, the versatile actor. It only wanted Frank Burns, and without that character, his career would never quite recover. Leaving the show was meant to be his leap into artistic independence. No more recycled jokes. No more one-note tantrums. No more Frank Burns. What he didn't expect was how tightly the character would cling to him. Casting directors, producers, and even fans couldn't see him as anyone else. To the industry, Linville was Frank nothing more in the years that followed. He moved from project to project, but nothing came close to the cultural impact of MASH Asterisk. He appeared in episodes of Murder, She Wrote, The Love Boat, and Fantasy Island, each role offering a brief glimpse of his range, but none giving him the chance to rebuild his career. Casting directors struggled to imagine him as anything except the whiny, bumbling surgeon from the 4077th. He had been typecast so deeply that he couldn't escape it. Meanwhile, his former co-stars flourished. Alan Alda became an acclaimed writer and director. Mike Farrell and Loretta Swit found steady, respected work. Even Gary Berghoff, who left around the same time, carried Radar's popularity into new opportunities. Compared to them, Linville's career seemed to stall. Soon, whispers began suggesting that he had made a terrible mistake by leaving the show when he did. His personal life suffered as well. A series of divorces took an emotional toll, and the fresh start he hoped for, the opportunity to reinvent himself and take on bold new roles, dwindled into a chain of near misses and disappointments. The industry that once embraced him now seemed to move on without looking back. And the cruelest twist was that Frank Burns, the very role he walked away from to save his career, became the only role anyone remembered him for. Fans loved to reminisce about his funniest meltdowns, his awkward attempts at romance, and the constant humiliations that defined Frank Burns? Decades later, people were still laughing at Frank, but they weren't hiring Larry. For Linville, it must have felt like he'd become trapped in the very cage he thought he was escaping. And while he did his best to move forward, a darker reality was waiting for him. Soon, it wouldn't just be his career weighing on him, it would be his health. Most fans only saw Larry Linville through the lens of his work, first as the unforgettable Frank Burns, and later as a familiar guest star on television. But behind the curtain, he was fighting battles far more serious than anything scripted on MASH *. For years, quietly struggled with personal and physical hardships that the public wouldn't learn about until it was too late. By the early 1990s, Linville's health took a sudden and dramatic turn. In 1993, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, shocking revelation, especially because he wasn't a smoker. The diagnosis devastated those close to him. It felt cruelly unfair. He had avoided one of the most common risks, yet still found himself facing one of the deadliest diseases. Doctors urged surgery, and Linville agreed. Part of his lung was removed in an attempt to stop the cancer from spreading. The operation was grueling, and the recovery painfully slow. Although he survived the procedure, his health never fully returned to what it had been. He appeared at fan conventions and continued taking occasional guest roles, but the changes were visible. He looked thinner. His energy was lower. The sharp comedic spark that once defined him seemed dimmed by exhaustion. Even so, he rarely spoke about his illness publicly. He smiled for fans, signed autographs, and tried to keep spirits high. Few realized how much strength it took simply to show up. His health wasn't his only struggle. Linville's personal life had already weathered multiple marriages and divorces, each bringing its own emotional weight. Friends later reflected that the combination of dwindling career opportunities, health challenges, and personal setbacks wore him down, though he tried hard not to let it show. He wasn't bitter. They said just quietly worn out by life's relentless blows. Some fans would later wonder if Linville had felt unwell long before his official diagnosis. Others speculated that the unending stress of playing Frank Burns, the constant humiliation, the typecasting, the lack of growth, may have taken a deeper toll on him than anyone realized. There is no definitive answer, but the thought lingers. Stress can carve deep wounds into the body, even when they remain invisible. By the late 1990s, cancer had spread, and Linville's health declined rapidly. Still relatively young, barely into his 60s, he was told there was little more doctors could do. On April 10, 2000, Larry Linville passed away at just 60 years old, leaving fans shocked and heartbroken. Many didn't know he'd been ill until after his death, and the news cast his earlier decision to leave MASH * in a far more human light. What once seemed like a reckless career move suddenly felt like the choice of a man searching for something deeper than fame time. Dignity and control over his own life. His illness hadn't been public knowledge when he walked away, but it colored the way people later viewed his journey. It's hard not to wonder whether Linville sensed, even unconsciously, that his time might be shorter than most. What makes his story so haunting is the contrast. On screen, he played a man who collapsed under the slightest pressure, a whiny, conniving coward who crumbled at every setback. Off-screen, Larry Linville showed a quiet resilience. He faced illness, disappointment, and decline with grace, never becoming bitter, never lashing out in his final years. He was nothing like Frank Burns. He was far stronger, even though his health struggles ultimately ended his life. They didn't erase his impact. Long after his diagnosis, long after the surgery, and long after his passing, Larry Linville lived on in the minds of millions forever, remembered as the ridiculous, unforgettable Major Frank Burns. Frank was never meant to be the star of MASH *. He wasn't heroic, he wasn't wise, and no one in the 4077th respected him. But he became unforgettable nonetheless. And yet, decades later, whenever people talk about the show, his name still comes up. Larry Linville created one of the most hated and, at the same time, it's one of the most unforgettable characters in television history. That alone is a legacy. When Linville left after season 5, fans braced for a shift. The writers replaced Frank with Charles Emerson Winchester III, played by David Ogden Stiers, a character who was arrogant but brilliant, cultured, and layered in ways Frank never was. It was a clever move, and Winchester brought an entirely new texture to the show. But even with Stiers' stellar performance, viewers could feel the difference. Without Frank Burns, MASH * lost its resident fool, the jealous, tantrum-prone troublemaker who added a chaotic spark to the camp. The dynamic changed. Some fans loved the newfound sophistication. Others felt a certain manic, unpredictable energy had vanished forever, and that's what made Linville's performance so remarkable. He made Frank bigger than the script. On paper, Frank was a one-note character, a rule-obsessed weakling, petty, jealous, and easy to humiliate. But Linville added dimension, making him irritating in ways that were almost endearing. You didn't respect Frank, but you couldn't look away from him. The twitch in his face whenever Margaret ignored him, the pathetic crack in his voice when he tattled to Colonel Blake, the way he unraveled under Hawkeye's insults, it was all meticulously crafted to make audiences laugh at him. Not with him. And yet, he never pushed Frank into pure parody. There was always just a flicker of humanity there, enough to make viewers feel a tiny sting of pity amid the laughter, that fragile balance comedy laced with tragedy. Mockery shading into sympathies what set Linville apart. Many actors have played fools, but very few have created one. People still talk. It's about half a century later. Linville once said he grew tired of the role because Frank never changed. But that's exactly why the character stayed etched into the audience's memory. In a show where nearly everyone else evolved, Frank stayed exactly who he was from start to finish. Whining, scheming, and failing over and over again. He became the constant, and in a strange way that made him timeless. What stands out today is how fans talk about Linville. People say I hated Frank Burns, but they say it with a smile. They hated the character, but loved the performance. Even younger generations, discovering MASH * through reruns or streaming, react the same way. This guy is awful. I can't stop watching him. That is the sign of a performance that outlasts its era. Linville reportedly learned to accept this with grace. He knew that Frank overshadowed everything else he'd done. But he also recognized that very few actors ever get the chance to play a character so iconic. He once joked that being remembered as Frank Burns wasn't such a bad fate because at least he was remembered. In an industry where countless actors disappear without a trace, Linville carved a permanent place in pop culture history, and that's the irony of his story. He left MASH * to escape the cage of Frank Burns, yet that very cage preserved his legacy. He may not have become the Hollywood star he once dreamed of being, but he became something rarer -- unforgettable. Frank Burns was a coward, a fool, a constant source of humiliation. But thanks to Larry Linville's talent and precision, he became one of television's greatest characters. In the end, that's what makes Larry Linville immortal. He may have feared being trapped as Frank Burns, but the truth is that Frank Burns ensured he would never be forgotten.